Hi, I'm Adam Porter, and this is my top 100 board game mechanisms, and this is now the top 20, number 20 to 11. So let's get stuck in. Number 20 is stock holding. So this is where I have stuff and it's worth a certain amount, but the value of that stuff changes throughout the game based on the player's actions. So a game I've mentioned a couple of times throughout this list already is the game Haben Gut, which is a pure stock holding game where we're buying stock and then we're adapting the price of that stock. We're trying to buy it when it's cheap and sell it when it's expensive. And so at the end of the game, the player with the most money is going to win the game. I find that a really satisfying thing, watching the value of things change. I really love the game Arcadia, which is a game where we're laying out polyomino type tiles and trying to surround those tiles in order to gain seals, so these little tokens, and the value of those seals is dependent on the colours that are showing on the top of a central castle. And so throughout the game we can adapt that, we can change the castle pieces on the top of that castle to try and make our seals more valuable. And then you've got to choose when are you going to sell those seals in order to get those rewards. Really satisfying. I really like the game Airlines Europe, where you've got control of a number of different airlines, you're laying out planes around the board, and every now and then there's a scoring round and you're going to score points based on who has the most of certain different types of airlines. We can get into really heavy stuff like 18xx. Now, 18xx are big train games that go on for hours and hours, hugely complicated, lots of economics, lots of money being exchanged. I've dabbled with 1830, found it a little bit too much, and that's probably an entry point into the genre as well, but I found it a little bit too much, a little bit too long, a little bit daunting for me. But I really enjoy the game Poseidon, which is a simplified 18xx game, which I don't think is particularly well loved, but I enjoyed it. It felt like a step up from something like Power Grid. Now, Power Grid also has a sort of a stock market of sorts, in that the cost of individual resources changes throughout the game based on a sort of supply and demand. You know, as resources are taken off the board, then they become more expensive. As they're put back onto the board, they become cheaper. And so again, choosing which resources to buy and when to power your power stations is a big part of the game. Number 19 is lying in games. So games where you get to tell outright lies and the other players have to look at your face and think, am I telling the truth? And read what's going on with you. So the purest one of these that I know of is Cockroach Poker. I absolutely love Cockroach Poker. It's one of my favourite games. This is a game where you basically just take a card and you pass it to the next player and you say, this is a spider, and they have to say whether they think it is a spider or it isn't a spider. That's essentially it. That's essentially the whole game. I mean, clearly there are some minor little rules in there that just make the game work, make it flow. But essentially that's it. Lying to other people and then them guessing whether you're telling the truth or not. I find it funny. I find it funny watching other people trying to lie, seeing them, you know, not being able to hold that poker face, you know, see them cracking up, playing it with children, and they, you know, they're trying to tell a lie, but they're giggling and it's written all over their face that they're lying, getting away with it, you know, double bluffs where you try and you make it look like you're lying even though you're not lying, so they accuse you of lying when you weren't. And so, you know, it's really, really satisfying. I find it an exciting mechanism in games. Another game that does it really well is the game Sheriff of Nottingham, where we get to put different resources, chickens, bread, cheese, and we put it into a little pouch, and then we have to pass it to the sheriff and we say, this is what I've got in my pouch. You tell them what we've got. I've got 3 chickens in that pouch. And they have to decide whether they think you do have 3 chickens and let it pass, or whether they think that you're lying and you're actually trying to sneak through some illegal bit of contraband. In which case they might say, no, I don't think so. I'm going to open your pouch, and if you were lying, you're going to take a penalty. And then you can start bribing the sheriff to say, oh, please don't open my pouch. And so you start bribing them, and you know, again, you can get those double bluffs where you're bribing them, and so they do open your pouch, but it turns out you were telling the truth all along, and so then they take a penalty. And you know, I find these games hilarious. And there's not that many of them where you get, there's lots of games where you get to bluff, and maybe we might talk about that a little bit later on, but there's lots of games where you get to bluff. But games where you get to outright tell a lie, I find that enjoyable. I do. Not in life. In life I try and avoid it. But in games, it's fun to do something that's a bit naughty. Yeah, something that you wouldn't normally do in everyday life. I find that great. I find that really, really engaging. Number 18 is another mechanism which is a bit mean-spirited and I guess, again, is something I probably wouldn't do in life, but I do really enjoy doing in a game, so a bit like the previous entry. And this is specific to one game that I know of. There probably are more games like this, so please tell me if you're aware of another game that uses this mechanism. But it's what I'm calling here the Dragon's Gold mechanism. So in Dragon's Gold, there are dragons laid out, they've got different types of treasure on them, and different players are going to be playing cards onto these dragons to try and defeat the dragons. So each dragon is going to be defeated when a certain total number of cards has been played to it, and that will be a combination of cards from different players. Now, all the players who have played cards to defeat that dragon are entitled to a share of that treasure. But you've got a time limit to agree what that share is going to be. So we turn over a timer and then you just argue it out. You say, I want this, and I want this. The other player says, I want this, and you've got to argue about it and come to an agreement. Now, if you don't come to an agreement within that time limit, nobody's getting anything. So you can really bully your way through that. You can stand firm and say, I'm afraid that's it. I'm either having all this stuff or we're not having anything. And it's that game of chicken, isn't it? How long can you hold that stance before you give in and say, all right then, I'll just have the one piece. You know? And I've played this with games of this where it's been really a sour experience, where people haven't enjoyed it at all because somebody's really gone for those bully tactics. And I've played games of it where it's really, really funny and enjoyable. So it's very much a game where you have to pick the players that you want to play it with. But it is one of the most memorable mechanisms that I've seen in games, and those games are the games themselves are very, very memorable to me. The games that I've had of it, I enjoy it. I don't pull this game out very often, but I think it's clever, and as far as I know, it's unique. It probably isn't, and you can correct me on that. So yeah, this is a game by Bruno Fedduti, and kudos to him for coming up with such a clever system. We've previously talked about the contract trick-taking games, and this particular entry in my list is also trick-taking games, but this one is point trick-taking games. And I'm also combining in this evasion trick-taking games. Okay, so in a trick-taking game, as I've mentioned in the previous video, you're playing a series of cards. So I play a card, the next player plays a card, the next player plays a card, and then the person who's played the highest card gets all of those cards and takes the trick and puts it in front of them. Now there's all sorts of other twists to it. Often you're having to follow suit, so if I play a blue card, everyone has to play a blue card if they've got one. Often there are trump suits and things like this, but the core of it is we each play a card in sequence and the highest card takes that set of cards. If you want to know more about trick-taking, please go back and watch some of my previous videos. I've got a lot of videos about trick-taking on the channel. But in a point trick-taking game, the value of the cards that you've taken is really important. So there's specific cards that you want, and you've got to manipulate which tricks you take in order to try and make sure you take those cards. And the reason I've brought in evasion is because it's exactly the opposite. This is where there are certain cards that you don't want, and so you're trying to avoid winning those tricks while you're certainly trying to achieve winning the other tricks with the high point scoring cards. So it's the same mechanism, just in reverse. And I find that really satisfying. It's the opposite to a plain trick-taking game. A plain trick-taking game is where we just play a series of tricks, and then the person who's won the most tricks, for example, would win the game. And it wouldn't matter the value of those tricks. It's just the case of winning a trick is a point, essentially. So in a point trick-taking game or an evasion trick-taking game, the specific cards matter. And the specific cards may even have special powers and things like this on them, as in a game like Chronicle. But ultimately, I enjoy that, trying to work out, right, in this round, that the cards that have been laid out, do I want them? Do I want all of them? So maybe there's a couple of high point scoring cards, but there's also a card that I'm trying to evade as well. Well, what's the balance there? Do I want that trick or don't I? And if so I play, so I'm winning a trick, but then somebody plays a card into that trick that I don't want, now I've got to take it because I won the trick, okay? I find that a really satisfying balance, a nice little puzzle to work out, and I think these are probably my favourite type of trick-taking games. Number 16 is very closely related to trick-taking, and this is climbing games, sometimes called ladder climbing games. So this is where you play a card, the next player then has to play a higher card, the next player has to play a higher card again, or it might be that you play a set of cards, so I might play 3 of a kind, the next player has to play 3 of a kind, but they've got to play a better 3 of a kind than me. And so we go around the table until somebody is unable to play, and then they get some sort of penalty. I find this a similar sort of puzzle to trick-taking, but actually I find it more engaging than trick-taking, and there are fewer of these games than there are trick-taking games, although there are some wonderful examples of it in the hobby. And mechanism number 15 is very closely related to climbing, and this is shedding games. So shedding games is where you've got a hand of cards and you're trying to get rid of your cards. Okay, you want to be the player that gets rid of all of your cards. And so when I was at school, we played a game which, do you know what, I'm not going to say the title because I don't know whether YouTube likes it if I swear or not, but the game was quite a sweary title. And it was a game where you had to play cards and they had to be higher than the previous cards, so it was a climbing game. But the goal of the game was to shed all of your cards, get rid of all your cards before everybody else. This game was reworked into a game called Ghost, it's got a load of O's in it, by Yellow and by Richard Garfield. And that's a neat implementation, at least a very pretty implementation of that game that I used to play as a kid. But it's also something that features shedding cards is the core of the game Llama, which was a very popular game, very successful game by Rainer Knizia and Amigo Spieler a couple of years ago. You also see it though in those games I've mentioned previously. I really enjoy games where you've got to say, where you play a card and then you've got to do something, a reaction, or say something. Dry Magius Spieler has a whole range of these different games like Cockroach Salad and Tarantula Tango and Plappa Ragai that I've talked about in a recent review. But in Plappa Ragai, we turn over a card, you've got to say something, and if you say the wrong thing or if you hesitate, then you have to take cards back into your hand. But you want to get rid of all your cards, you want to shed your cards in order to win the game. I really enjoy that mechanism because of the big wins and the big losses, the big exciting moments, you know, and the way you can pull it back. You know, the opponent takes, okay, you've been taking cards for a while, but you've not been taking huge numbers of cards, and then the opponent has a particularly big loss. They take a load of cards back into their hand that prevents them from shedding all their cards, and you know, those big swings are quite satisfying, quite exciting. Number 14 is wordplay. We often talk about word games in this hobby, and to me it's never very clear whether we're talking about spelling games or games about wordplay. So I'm not using the word games. I think is a confusing term, a confusing genre. So here we're talking about games with wordplay. So wordplay would be something like code names, where I've got to give a clue to the other players, which is going to point them towards different cards in this grid, and I want to point them to as many cards as I possibly can. So I want to find a word which links a bunch of different cards. So a clever vocabulary, knowing the other players around the table and what they're going to interpret from the clue that you give. This is also featured in the recent game from Blue Orange called Cross Clues, which is a very similar, much lighter, simpler version of Codenames, essentially, where we've got a grid. You're trying to connect specifically two words. So that, yeah, you've got a grid reference and it says, right, you need to connect this word and this word. You've got to come up with a single word clue, and the other players have to guess which two words you're trying to connect together. I find it fires off a bunch of the sort of creative, the creative part of my brain, really, trying to work out what I want to do. In a lot of these games, there is a bit of a problem that, you know, people might sit around for quite a while and think of their clues, which is quite a quiet moment in otherwise a party game. So I think there are some issues with this mechanism, but that not issues enough to stop these games being wildly successful. I really like the game Huh or Hein, which I've mentioned previously because it uses the Dixit scoring mechanism. But in that game, you've got to come up with a clue that points towards a certain film or celebrity or something like that. And you want to make that clue obscure enough that the other players don't all guess it, but clever enough that you know, obvious enough that some players guess it. So the same mechanism as in Dixit. And in fact, Dixit is another example of really clever wordplay, isn't it? Trying to come up with a clever clue that other players are going to guess, but it's not too obvious. And, you know, it's a mechanism that just makes me feel clever when I manage to pull it off. Like I've really achieved something impressive there. Number 13 on the list, ironically, involves no communication at all. This is limited communication games. Games where certain players, or maybe all players, can't actually speak to each other. The game Magic Maze, where we're all moving around this shopping mall, or this maze, and we're trying to find certain locations and certain items, but we can't actually speak to each other. So it's all played in real time, and we've got this, I can only move pieces down, somebody else can only move them left, somebody else can only move them up, and so on. There's certain things you want the other players to be doing, but you can't actually tell them. All you can do is tap this red wooden pawn to say, do something, and they're thinking, what? I don't know what you want me to do. I find that really fun, the fact that everyone's desperate to speak, but they can't, they're not allowed. Other games that use limited communication, things like Mysterium and Deception, Murder in Hong Kong. So this is where one player knows information, but they can't tell you. All they can do is give you clues. So in Mysterium, they're going to give you images that represent dreams, and you've got to interpret what they're trying to tell you. In Deception, Murder in Hong Kong, they're going to place tokens onto a board that give you clues as to the nature of a murder. And what the crime scene looked like, and then you've got to try and interpret that to determine who the murderer was, what the weapon was used, and so on. I find that limitations on communication can create really unique situations and unique puzzles for the players. And they really help to eliminate the alpha player problem that can occur in cooperative games too, so that's a real positive as well. Number 12 is stacking games. So games where you physically put one piece on top of another to build a tower, and you hope it doesn't collapse. As simple as that. Why do I enjoy that? I mean, I can't really say. It's just fun, isn't it? It's just tactile. It's exciting watching that tower swaying. There are big moments in these games. You know, the big moment is that time when that person puts the piece on top of their tower and you're sure it's going to collapse and it doesn't, even though it's swaying in the wind. That's a big moment. Few games achieve moments as tense as that. Few big strategy games achieve that, and yet something as simple as stacking a bunch of blocks on top of each other does achieve it. The moment when it collapses, it's loud, it's exciting, pieces go everywhere. Visually, it looks great, it's tactile. I just think few games have moments as exciting as the moments that you get in a stacking game. And I've never played any other games where people get their cameras out as much as in a stacking game. If I play a game of Bandu or Junkart, you can guarantee that players are going to have their phones out and they're going to be taking photos of their structures. I've no idea what they're going to do with these photos because no one's going to be interested. But in that moment, you feel so proud of what you've managed to achieve, you can't help but snapping pictures of it. I mean, that's a sign of an exciting game, isn't it? And finally, number 11, which I enjoy for very similar reasons, big moments in games. This is flicking games, another type, one of the other big genres of dexterity games. Flicking games where we're flicking a piece across the board, try and make contact with another piece, or to try and get into a certain location, so accuracy-based flicking games. I've made a whole video recently about top 10 mechanisms used in flicking games. These are games that require a lot of skill, or a lot of these flicking games are, so games that you can get really good at. Crokinole is a great example of a game that you can get really skilled at if you really take the time to learn, or you can play it pretty casually. But big moments, big wins, big losses, you know, you aim the piece and you completely miss and mess up. That's exciting, it's funny. Or you make an impossible shot that wins you the game. There's a big moment of celebration there. I think flicking games can be oddly thematic as well. Catacombs does a really, really good job of this, and Flick 'em Up as well. The fact that you can hide behind a bit of terrain and then flick an arrow or flick a bullet out from beside it. The big monsters are bigger discs, small monsters are tiny discs. Traveling through open ground is dangerous, yeah, where there's nothing to hide behind because somebody else could shoot you. You can see from the scenarios that are created in games of Catacombs and Flick 'em Up, and the different types of monsters and their powers, just how kind of thematic this stuff can be. The fact is, unlike a dungeon crawler where you're rolling dice and moving around a grid and looking up statistics, here we're actually doing what we're supposed to be doing. If you want to attack somebody, you run in and you attack them. If you want to shoot somebody from behind a pillar, you place your arrow, you flick it, and you try and make contact. And you try and avoid that fiery pit in the middle. So I just find it very dynamic and totally engaging and immersive. So I love flicking games, it's one of my favourite mechanisms. As always, we're also going to talk about one mechanism that I don't enjoy in games. And today the mechanism, well, it's not really a mechanism, it's a situation that can arise in certain games for various different reasons. But I think the reasons are fairly common to each other. I don't like it when I'm playing a game and I think the game is about to end because the certain sort of end game criteria is about to be hit, and then somebody does something that changes that. They either change the end game criteria itself, or they change the game state in such a way that we're going to end up playing for another 20 minutes or so. Often it's when I'm not enjoying these games or I'm losing badly and I'm thinking, well, at least the game's going to be over soon. There are few moments in gaming that I find as frustrating as playing a game and thinking it's about to end and then finding that it doesn't and I've got to keep playing for a little bit longer. I really think that's been some of my worst gaming experiences, have been in situations like that. So it could be, for example, when a game says the game's going to end when a certain player has a certain number of cards on the table in front of them, but then perhaps a player plays a card which allows them to destroy one of the cards in front of one of the other players. You think, well, we've just added an amount of time onto this game, which, I mean, that's no fun. If I'm not enjoying the game, I want it to be over. I thought it was going to be over and now it's not. I mean, perhaps the problem here is that I'm not enjoying the game in the first place, rather than the mechanism that extends the gameplay. Another example would be the game Niagara. I remember having that sort of situation where you're gathering certain gems from this river, and I really enjoy the mechanisms in Niagara, the fantastic table presence and the way that the river shifts. That's all great. But you're gathering a certain number of gems in order to end the game, but those gems can be stolen from you. So you can, and it takes quite an effort to get these gems, and so then to have the gems stolen just as you thought the game was going to finish, and then you think, well, that's just added a whole 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes onto the gameplay. Oh, I don't really enjoy that at all. I think that end game trigger, you know, if I can see it coming, I want it to actually happen. I remember similar instances in games of Citadels and Guildhall. I remember having bad experiences with these games because I wasn't enjoying it, I was losing badly, and then the game just seemed to go on and on and on because of the actions of the other players. And through no fault of theirs, because the game mechanisms allowed them to make a strong strategic move for themselves, but ultimately it just elongated the game and elongated the suffering for me and perhaps for other players around the table. Anyway, I know that's not really a mechanism, that's a feeling, that's a situation that games can create, so please forgive me for that. Please do come back and watch my final video, numbers 10 to number 1 in my top 100 board game mechanisms of all time. Please comment on this video, let me know what mechanisms you enjoyed, what mechanisms you didn't, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you next time. All the best.